Well, good evening, folks. I see we have a couple still connecting here. I was just talking to Hunter Oswald, the wonderful student assistant who is my techie in setting these talks up. And we wondered if we would have a smaller than usual audience tonight because I didn't even think of this when we set up this topic. Can you imagine offering a lecture on taxation on the day after tax day? I mean, I suspect most people are probably pretty darn tired of taxes right now. And here we are talking about taxes a day later. So I apologize for the timing. And I have to say, inherently, it's not the most cheerful topic, but like it or not, we have to deal with it. So let me just start you off with some historical anecdotes before we get into specifically American taxation. Taxes have been a huge part of human history. You probably all know the story of the Rosetta Stone. That's where they cracked the language code of Egyptian hieroglyphics and something called demotics. I'm not a linguist, so I can't tell you if I'm even saying that correctly. But there was this big stone that had the same wording in hieroglyphics, in demotics, and in Greek. And of course, they knew Greek, and so they were able to use the Greek to, find enough things in common where they were able to crack the code, so to speak, of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The thing that's funny is, what's the content on the Rosetta Stone? It was their tax code. Go figure. So if it weren't for taxes, we might not have ever figured out the ancient Egyptian language there. Interesting story of tax history in the Bible. You know, the Jewish people, you know about the losing of the 10 tribes to Babylon and then later the last couple to Rome. Well, both of those involved tax revolts. In other words, the ancient Israelites were getting along reasonably. I mean, there was friction, no doubt about it. They weren't always at peace with their neighbors, but it was when they engaged in tax revolts that the larger powers said enough of that and smashed them down. The great Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, that was kind of a golden age of the empire. I mean, we lovers of individual liberty like the Roman Republic that preceded it because it had more individual rights. But Caesar Augustus was a pretty wise fellow. He had low tax rates, and that helped stabilize the society. It didn't create a large financial incentive for certain groups of people to plot against him to overthrow him. And so he had a reign of whatever it was, 30 or 40 years. And a lot of that was attributable to an enlightened tax policy. It's an interesting story in the early days of Islam, where Islam, of course, expanded by conquest. And as was often the case in those days, a city that really just didn't have the manpower or the wealth to put together a big army, sometimes they would be under the umbrella of a larger power and they would pay tax to them. We call it a protection racket today, but it was needed. I mean, in a world where there was a lot of scuffling and skirmishes, conflicts, etc., it's kind of nice for a small city to have a larger protector. And of course, they paid for it. Well, in this one case, this Islamic group came along and said, okay, we're your protectors. And they collected the tax. And then all of a sudden, the geopolitical winds shifted, and this much larger, more powerful force was moving into that area. And the Muslims said, oops, this is a lot more than we can handle. But they gave back the taxes they had collected to this Christian village and said, hey, we're really sorry, but we made a deal. We can't keep it, so it's not right for us to keep your tax money. So they returned the tax money to the Christians, and they went riding off in the sunset to wherever they were going. And the Christians said, God bless you, God bring you back to us someday. So a lot of times, even the idea of religious affiliation, we like to think it was due to deep spiritual convictions, but in some cases, it was just pragmatic. Go with the people who take the best care of you for the best, maybe for the lowest tax tribute. In English history, taxes were very significant. Henry VIII was a notorious spendthrift, and that's why he went after the Catholic Church's properties. He could never have enough revenue, kind of bankrupted Old England. Well, when his daughter took over after that brief reign of Edward the Sixth in between, but when Queen Elizabeth the First reigned for whatever it was, 50 years or something like that, 40 or 50, she was a very frugal monarch and low taxes. And it was such a relief after, Henry VIII with his high taxes, so that after several decades of her rule, when the Spanish Armada decided to attack England, she could see that there was going to be conflict with Spain. And so she put a plea out to her nobles and the citizens that could afford it and said, hey, if you can come to the defense of your country, this is the time where we need you. And they were so grateful that they had had decades of low taxes under her that she raised more money than they even needed and were able to repel the Spanish invasion. So, it's just interesting how taxes seem to play such a crucial role in human history. In economic literature, we kind of inherited from that good and wise tariff collector, customs agent, and professor of moral philosophy, Adam Smith. When he wrote The Wealth of Nations and published it in 1776, it included 4 principles of taxation. And you can see the wisdom of each of these. The first is simply taxes should take into consideration the ability of the taxed person to pay. In other words, you don't want to crush them. You don't want to just smash the life out of them. You skim off a portion that they can afford, and don't make an enemy out of them. Don't make a rebel out of them. Just like Caesar Augustus, keep the taxes modest. Second is that the good tax should have clarity and certainty and transparency. There shouldn't be any surprises. You shouldn't get ambushed. It shouldn't be arbitrary. It should be very clear right from the start. This is what you'll owe. There's no tricks here. There's no hidden gimmick, no surprises. This is it. Just keep it very certain and predictable. Third, a wise tax should be convenient. It's just easy to pay. And lastly, it should be economical to collect. It shouldn't be some monstrosity that imposes its own burden on a society. I can give you an example of a society that is burdened by a very uneconomical, a very expensive mode of collection. That's the United States of America today. It's estimated each year, you've probably read these articles, 6.5 billion man hours, excuse me, maybe it's human hours these days, it's people hours. 6.5 billion a year we spend, computing and paying and collecting the taxes. Over $360 billion if you put it in monetary terms. This is not a wise tax, at least according to good old Adam Smith. All right, let's kind of just briefly run through the US history with taxes. You all know the story of the American Revolution. One of the big issues was that England was taxing us and the colonists. And the rates weren't particularly oppressive. They were single digit often. It wasn't so much that they were completely crushing in terms of the high rates, but it was the fact that those taxes were being imposed and the colonists had no representation in Parliament. So there was the revolutionary slogan of, no taxation without representation. And the colonists felt strongly about it, that they challenged the greatest military power in the world, and thank goodness eventually prevailed and gave birth to this country. But, I think today, I make an issue, maybe you've read it in some of my articles, I'm kind of a nut about the national debt. It just dismays me that we are $34 trillion in debt, because that reflects expenditures that our government has made that have not yet been paid for. What is deficit spending? What is this borrowing of the national debt? It is a tax to be collected in the future. And it's going to be paid for in many cases by young Americans who aren't even old enough to vote now. They had zero say in the programs that were funded by the taxes, and yet they're going to have to pay those taxes. That is taxation without representation. It's a truly un-American thing that we're doing to our young people. The federal government was very small. I think I told you in an earlier lecture, it took from 1789 to 1850 for the federal government to spend in total a little over $1 billion. And in the 50 years from 1850 to 1900, the total federal expenditures were about $15 billion. That's for a half a century. We're very close to spending $15 billion a day now. I mean, it's at least 10, and who knows when it'll be 15. So there's a quantum difference in the scope of the national government. But originally, because government was smaller, the tax needs were lower, thank goodness. And the federal government basically relied on indirect taxes as opposed to direct taxes. A direct tax would be like the income tax that we pay. The government says, hey, send us the money. You owe it. They come directly to us. Indirect taxation is simply taxing us through an intermediary, whether it be an excise tax on gasoline. I just looked it up today. Pennsylvania has the largest excise, all across the country, everybody pays 18.4 cents excise tax on each gallon of gas. And then the state government in Harrisburg puts an additional 57 cents or so excise tax. But that's considered indirect because it's collected by the people who sell the gas. And a sales tax is an indirect tax. So it was indirect taxation through much of our country's history. And one of the reasons was the great respect for privacy. Our 10th Amendment says that the 9th Amendment says that those rights that are not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, we assume that individuals in the states have them. Well, one of those unmentioned rights is the right to privacy. And so it was none of Uncle Sam's business how much money you earned, and they had no authority to tax your income. They got most of their revenue actually through tariffs. And tariffs is a very debatable issue these days, but the founders understood there are two kinds of tariffs. There are these small tariffs, low rates, 4, 6, 8%. Those were called revenue tariffs. And that meant that their purpose was to gather revenue to the government. And so we would have the foreigners would export things to us. When we would import them, our government would put a tariff, an import tariff on them for the purpose of just raising some money that was used to fund the Navy and just help administer the government. The other kind of tariff is called a protective tariff, and that's where the rates are jacked up so high that it dissuades foreign producers from even trying to export into the United States. The purpose is specifically to block out the foreign product to protect domestic industry. And there's always a trade-off in terms of, who benefits. Obviously, with protective tariffs, domestic industries profit as a result, but at the expense of American consumers who can't get access to the cheaper goods that would otherwise be available. And we could have a debate all night about just what the right amount of tariffs is, and we're not going to solve that issue. But I just wanted you to see that in the early generations, our government's major source of revenue in many years was revenue tariffs, modest tariffs, not designed to exclude foreign products from the American market, but rather to get a little bit of an income stream funding the government from those imports into our country. Civil War, guess what? They started taxing income because war is expensive. After the war, income tax was stricken down by the US Supreme Court. It wasn't constitutional. There was no authority for it, but in the emergency of the war, the governments went ahead and northern and southern and imposed income taxes. There was another income tax that Congress voted for in the 1890s. Again, the Supreme Court struck it down. But then we had a major turning point in American history, that fateful year of 1913 when the Federal Reserve was born and the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, which installed an income tax. And in fact, a graduated income tax, which was Karl Marx's brainchild. He believed that you tax The more income somebody makes, you don't tax at a flat rate. See, a flat rate is a tax where everybody pays the same rate. So a person who earns 10,000, say the flat tax rate, 10%. You earn $10,000, 10% of that is 1,000, that's your tax. You make $100,000, 10% of that is $10,000, that's what you pay. So you would have a situation or a flat tax where different taxpayers pay different amounts, but it's proportionate to their income. You know, we price insurance that way. People who have a more expensive house, they pay a higher insurance premium, you know, because they need the additional protection. So, you know, you can justify that as a fair system of taxation. But Marx, with his graduated or progressive income tax, it was the more your income went up, the higher the rate. See, one of the interesting mantras in American domestic politics of the last 50, 60 years was, let's do away with discrimination. And that's done a lot of good. You know, it's taken some handicaps off of women, off of minorities and that. But there's one minority that gets singled out. They don't want to treat it like everybody else, and that's the rich. No, we got to have separate laws for the rich. We got to have higher tax rates for the rich. That's the Marxian approach. It's not the traditional American approach. It's not the traditional theory of justice where everybody is treated equally or proportionally by the law. And since the creation of the 16th Amendment, oh my goodness, of course, that was accompanying the whole progressive movement in this country, where the philosophy that took over, that dominated, was that the federal government needs to do more and more things for more and more people. It needs to be an economic helper to the American people. Well, that takes money. That's taxes. So they're always scrambling for more taxes, and the 16th Amendment gave them the power to do it. The interesting thing is when the first tax, you know, it took them a year to set up the income tax, but in 1915, the top rate was only 7%. And that was on an income of $50,000. $50,000, that's like $2 million today, and only 7%. You know, you won't find that low a tax rate on millionaires today. And actually, at the beginning, it was a status symbol. I pay federal income tax, and your neighbor, ooh, you're near the top. But in 1916, the top rate went from 7% to 16%. In 1917, we went into World War I, and the top rate zoomed to 67%. In 1918, it zoomed to 77%. After the war, went down, top rate at 25%. We had the Roaring 20s. Hoover decided to raise taxes during an economic slowdown in 1930. Top rate was restored to 63%. And we see the economic impact of heavy taxation. You know, Smith warned, he talked about the ability to pay, and a tax burden should not be crushing. 63% tax rate by Hoover crushed a lot of the American economy. And so tax revenues went down. So people think that if the rate goes up, the tax revenue to the government has to go up. No, if you make the rate too high, people go out of business. People just bury their money in the backyard. They invest it overseas. They do something to avoid the tax man. It's just human nature. Tax rates went up to 91% and briefly 94% under Franklin Roosevelt. John Kennedy lowered the top rate from 91% to 70%. And we had a nice little boom there in the 60s. And then you had Reagan. Reagan first lowered the top rate from 70% to 50%. That took effect in 1983. And then in 1986, he got the top rate all the way down to 28%. And even Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, said, oh, this sounds like voodoo economics. It's going to be terrible for deficits. And of course, the big spenders on the other side of the partisan aisle, who never blinked an eye at spending more money. They weren't worried about deficits when they were spending money, but oh, you're going to cut into our tax revenue. That's a no-no, Mr. Reagan. It didn't happen. You know, Reagan's era was the year of supply-side economics. I'll get into that in just a second, but the charge was, you've cut those tax rates. Now federal revenue is going to collapse and the deficit will get larger. Fast forward to the end of Reagan's presidency in 1989. He left office in January of 89. Yeah, deficits went up. But not because of the tax cuts. when the first tax cuts of Reagan, when he lowered the rate to 50%, when that took effect in 1983, it took him a year or so to get it passed and then for it to take effect. 1983. In 1983, federal revenue was $600 billion. In 1989, federal revenue was $1 trillion. It had gone up by 2/3. The tax cuts led to a larger economic pie and much greater revenues for the federal government. Yes, the deficit went up, but it wasn't because tax revenue went down. Tax revenue went up. The problem was spending went up even more. Okay. And then the top rates bounced around in recent presidents, 35%, 38%, whatever. I mentioned supply side. In the 1930s, there was a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. And because he was in the English tradition of neoclassical economics, they were engineers. And so they viewed the economy as kind of a machine. And so you want to tweak the machine. You want to gas it up, goose it up, to make things go. When the economy is stagnant, when the economy is booming, you want to kind of put the brakes on a little bit. And one way you would do that would be cut taxes during a recession and raise taxes during a boom. The only thing is, democratic governments don't work that way. I mean, politicians will often cut taxes for you if it'll get votes, but politicians not going to get taxes. They're not going to be made popular by raising your taxes. And yet, I can remember under President Obama, he had a Treasury Secretary named Timothy Geithner, and there had been some tax cuts that had been enacted under Obama's predecessor, George W. Bush, and they were set to expire. And Geithner was saying, oh, don't let them expire. We need the revenue. And it's like even Keynes, and he had the gall to say, well, John Maynard Keynes said, no, he wasn't practicing Keynesian economics at all because there was this economic slowdown at that time. Keynes would have all been in favor of cutting tax rates or at least keeping the existing tax cuts, extending them. But Geithner was opposed to that because his ideology was just spending. Okay, let's talk about the fair share argument, the ethics of taxation. And we've seen the economics of it is just, high tax rates are punitive and they suppress economic activity and decrease government revenue. Low tax rates allow the economy to breathe, to grow, to expand. And guess what? Then they spin off greater tax revenues. But the fairness, it doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative. Americans have always cared about fairness. And, we had this idea of there was the poll tax, which is a head tax. Everybody pays the same. If you have a poll tax, your government's going to be really, really small because your tax rate will only be high enough for the poor people to afford. And poor people can't afford much taxes at all. So if you tax everybody the same, it's going to be low, 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 low. So it may be a libertarian's dream, but it's not practical in today's America. You got the flat tax, which is we talked about before, where everybody pays the same rate. The more you make, the more you pay, but you're paying at the same rate. It's still proportional. And then, of course, you've got the Marxian progressive tax. And you've got people today saying the rich aren't paying their fair share, but the corporations aren't. And I'll talk about corporations a little later. The public perception of this it's partly at fault. There's so much demagoguery and misinformation that goes out there about taxes. Wall Street Journal just posted something a couple of weeks ago about the public perception of how much the top 1% of American, earners, the rich, the top 1% of our income folks, 22% of Americans think that they only pay 1% of the income tax. 25% of Americans think that the top 1% pays 12% of the total revenue that comes to Uncle Sam through the income tax. Another 20% weren't really sure. So you got a majority who thinks that they just pay a lot less than they do. Because in 2020, the top 1% of our earners paid 42% of income taxes. And in 2021, which is the most recent year I've got data for, 45% of the total income tax was paid by the top 1%. So you can see it's really, we have we probably have the most progressive or graduated effective tax rates in the world. You know, a lot of times the socialists in Congress say, we should be more like Sweden, we should be more like Norway. Their taxes aren't as graduated as ours. They don't have the top 1% paying over 40%, or our top percent. Now, in 1980, when Reagan was elected, the top percent paid 48% of the personal income tax. In 2007, that went up from 48% of the tax to 71% of the tax. Remember, this is the top 10% now of earners. And in 2021, the top 10% of American income tax earners paid 75.8% of the federal income tax. Excuse me. I think I'm going a little fast because there's a lot of material here. So let me make sure I try to hit some of the highlights. You know, the bottom half, bottom 50%, that's 76.8 million tax returns. They earned 10.4% of total income. Now they paid 2.3% of the total. This is the bottom half, not the bottom 10%. The bottom half only paid 2.3% of the federal income tax. And the bottom 60% now, no, the bottom 40%, sorry, had an average tax rate, the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of earners actually had an effective tax rate that was negative. Instead of them paying the government taxes, the government paid them in various programs. It was a negative tax equivalent to 27.6%. So we've got a very graduated tax. And what could be fairer? And this is what gets frustrating with the political rhetoric. Make the rich pay their fair share. They never specify what that is. But do they think it should be more than 45%? Gets a little silly after. Okay, let me just quickly here. Maybe I'll get done a little early tonight since taxation isn't the most curious topic. Let's talk about some other taxes. I've got a couple brief comments about the property tax. Historically, that's been a major funder. It's used primarily at the state and local level to fund public education in America. All I'll say about the property tax is that it's anachronistic. It's outdated. It made a lot of sense 250 years ago when we had an agrarian society. I mean, the farmer that had 200 acres was going to generate more income than the farmer that had 50 acres. You know, your real property often had a whole lot to do with your income. And so taxing your property, it was a proxy for taxing your income. But today, I mean, a house is a consumer good. You know, we've got less than 2% of Americans are farmers. I don't know what percent of Americans use their homes as a source of income. It's gone up in recent years, I'm sure, because of the Airbnb movement, but it's still, I mean, for your average, you know, think of the people who live on your street. How many of them is their home, their place of business, and their source of income? Very few, if any. And so, you know, doesn't it make more sense just to tax our income? Because that determines your ability to pay. Remember Adam Smith's principle, the ability to pay. The size of house you live in does not make you more able to pay more taxes if you live in a large house. It's irrelevant. So it doesn't fit the modern society to tax property. I mean, try changing it to something else. I mean, there's a lot of inertia that's just, you know, it'd be very tough to change. But when you think about it, it doesn't make sense. And I do think there's one very, very absolutely unfair aspect of the property tax, and that is that somebody could have paid a mortgage faithfully for 30 years, paid off the house, 100% ownership. They're retired, they've had a couple setbacks, all of a sudden they can't afford to pay the property tax on their house, and that house can be confiscated and taken away from them, even though it was fully paid for. That is troublesome, you know, to a country that historically has valued property rights as highly as the United States of America has. So those are my comments about the property tax. I don't think it's going to lead to any changes, but maybe we'll get lucky and someday it will. Another tax is the inheritance tax. Let's tax the estate of those rich people. And again, here's the spirit of Karl Marx. I think I mentioned earlier lecture in the 80s, I wrote a book on, kind of had the hyperbolic title, America's March Toward Communism, but in an economic sense, that's the direction we were going. I took Marx's 10-point platform for how to socialize an economy, and we've been going toward the fulfillment of those 10 points. Different presidents to different amounts. Under Obama, we were running full speed ahead under all 10. Under current president, quite a bit too. And one of his provisions, well, provision number 2, plank number 2 of the 10 planks was the graduated income tax, which we've already talked about. And plank number 3 was the inheritance tax. And of course, that's because Marx, we know he said right in the Communist Manifesto, his agenda can be summed up in one phrase, the abolition of private property. But there were a couple other very important social institutions that Karl Marx was also opposed to, and he wanted to abolish. One was religion, and another was families. He did not believe in the nuclear family. He believed that child rearing should be a social undertaking. Don't ask me how he envisioned that actually working out in practice. But that was one of his reasons for inheritance taxes. He didn't want somebody who made a good living to be able to pass it on to their children. He just thought it should go into the communal purse, so to speak, to be shared by everybody. And it would tend to break up families. And, the egalitarians love it because he said, well, we don't like rich people. You got Bernie Sanders saying there should be no billionaires. You got some of his followers saying, guillotine the rich. And this is kind of a demented attitude, but it's out there. And, Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, the top rate then was 40% on estates. Admittedly, it's large estates, like 12 million or something, although there's people with estates far larger than that. And a top tax rate on them of 40%. She proposed raising that top rate from 40% all the way up to 65%, a 62.5% increase in the tax rate on inheritances. And it's like, why are you so hostile to families? Why are you so hostile to success? And it's like, well, we can't let the economic power be concentrated in the hands of this elite. Well, if you want to talk about economic power being concentrated, those politicians should look in the mirror. I mean, Uncle Sam spends, what is it now, $6 trillion a year? That's economic power. You get some guy like Jeff Bezos worth 100 or 150 $1 billion. He's not going to be able to run the country. Whereas Congress, they run through 6 trillion every year. So it's kind of a false alarm in my book, and just and really, the history of inherited wealth is it's actually been a tragedy for a lot of individuals to inherit big wealth. They don't know what to do with it. But we're getting into sociology there, so I'll drop that. But one of the economic harmful consequences of the inheritance tax is if the bulk of that value is tied up in a business, and the only way somebody's going to be able to write a check for $20 million to Uncle Sam is going to be to break up or sell or liquidate the business. And it's like, why do you want to do that? You got a productive enterprise that's working well and it's serving the needs of people and it's generating, an ongoing stream of income just from the employees that they're paying and the economic activity that they're generating. Let it continue. But sometimes these taxes can actually shut down a business, and then you end up with less tax revenue unless these people find other jobs. But it is economic dislocation from these inheritance taxes, and they don't make a lot of sense unless you're a good Marxian. Let me talk now about Social Security taxes. Oh my goodness. And of course, this is a political hot potato, and everybody knows that the numbers don't add up, and that at some point here, we're going to have to make a change. And either there's going to have to be fewer benefits paid out, or there's going to have to be higher taxes imposed, probably both. But the politicians of both parties, this is not a partisan issue here, Politicians of both parties keep kicking the can down the road. I mean, it's almost like an untouchable third rail in electoral politics. Let me give you a little background. My mom, by the way, early in her work career, one of her first jobs was passing out Social Security numbers. The act was passed in the mid-1930s, but it only got enough votes to pass and become law in exchange for the adoption of what was called the Clark Amendment. And that was a promise by Social Security's advocates to study private sector alternatives so that Americans could have a choice between Social Security, which is a government-run program, you're giving your money to the government, as opposed to maybe a private investment firm or financial institution or whatever. Well, they got Social Security passed, and guess what? The Clark Amendment was forgotten. No congressional committee ever got around to examining private alternatives to Social Security. So, I mean, that was the trend of the 30s. Everything was more government. This was FDR's big deal, New Deal program, bigger government all the time. And Social Security was a symptom of that. Social Security really, I think, kind of undermined our constitutional order. Constitution doesn't authorize the federal government to be involved in the personal financial planning of Americans, but it was very tempting. Uncle Sam was basically saying, excuse me, participate in this program, and we'll make sure that if you retire and you don't have enough money, we've got a little bit of a cushion for you, so you won't have to be impoverished in your senior years. Very tempting. It raised the price of labor because, of course, it is a tax on labor. Originally, it was very modest, 1% taken out of the paycheck that goes to the worker, and then matched by another 1% that the worker never sees, but the employer has to pay that. So what the employer withholds, the employee's share and the employer's share are both paid by the employer directly to the government. So it's kind of an indirect tax for the individual worker. He doesn't really see it. But of course, now with the Social Security and Medicare thing being 7.65% times 2, in other words, the employee sees his statutory rate of pay immediately reduced by 7.6%. He might not realize that at the same time, his employer has to pay double that amount to Uncle Sam each quarter. That's called a tax wedge. It's like the employer's paying more and getting less labor, and then or able to afford less labor, and the laborer, the employee, he thinks he's getting paid this because that's what it says, your salary is such and such, but he actually receives less. And sometimes this breeds friction between the employee and the employer. It's not the employer's fault. It's the law. It's Uncle Sam. And in the annals of famous government promises that have been broken, Americans were assured, they were promised, that the most you'd ever pay into Social Security was $30 a year. It's up in the 5 figures now. I mean, it went over 10,000 years ago, and it just keeps going up and up and up. And unfortunately, Social Security sort of helped government with its spend now and pay later. It created a moral hazard because people started thinking, gee, Uncle Sam's going to take care of me. I don't have to save as much. So our savings rate took a hit as a result of just assuming that government would have enough money to pay for everybody. But you see, the politicians couldn't resist it. For the first 45 years, periodically, Congresses or ambitious presidents would jack up the benefits more than they jack up the revenue, of course. So you've all heard of Ida Mae Fuller, the first recipient retiree who paid $24 into the system and collected $22,000 by the time she passed. That's kind of the way Social Security was designed. I mean, life expectancy was a lot lower then, so not every person was going to make that kind of windfall profit from it. She was one of the lucky ones. But in 1980, the average retiree would go on to receive lifetime benefits of $203,000 from Social Security after putting $93,000 into it. So you can see why this became untouchable. Everybody said, this is the greatest deal there is. But projections in more recent years are that future retirees are going to get back tens of thousands of dollars less than they pay into Social Security. So what was this fantastic deal for several decades and built up all this loyalty to the Social Security system, it's going to come back and ambush the later people. We still don't have a private competitor to Social Security. You know, the socialist idea of government and the progressive idea of government overseeing our economic welfare has continued. And the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare just run up into the trillions, tens of trillions actually. And then we've got a good news, bad news story. Life expectancy is a lot longer today than it was in 1935 when the Social Security Act was passed. And so they actually have raised the retirement age from 65 to 60, and it would be 67 in a few more years. Not nearly enough to make the program actuarially sound. And of course, we've got all these biotech breakthroughs happening. You know, you can have more and more Americans living to be 90 and 100 and all that. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is Social Security can't afford to pay those people for all those decades of life. So, you know, there's an idea where the government made a program sound like it was the cat's meow, but it's going to come back to bite us in the end. All right, wealth taxes. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but this is one of the popular political issues today from the left. They keep saying, we need money so badly, and they do. I mean, these deficits are ridiculous because the spending is ridiculous, but they want to tax paper wealth, essentially. It's like if somebody has a whole lot of stock, they want to tax a portion of it now. The problem is it's not actual income. It will be someday, and that's when it should be taxed, when it's been realized. Say somebody's got $50 million in taxes, and you say, well, that's too much. Give Uncle Sam $2 million of that. 10 years later, the guy goes to sell his investment. It fell on hard times, and it's only worth $2 million. So Uncle Sam going to give him a refund? Don't count on it. You know, there are just all sorts of logistical problems to paying a wealth tax, and it's economically ignorant because this is the capital, this is the savings that finance future production. So just, you know, tax income at the time that it's realized. By selling the stock, capital gains tax. Corporation pays a dividend, you pay an income tax on the dividend. That's fine. That's real income. I mean, at least you're taxing something that's real and actual. A wealth tax is a hypothetical income. It may indeed become income in the future, but you don't know today how much it's going to be worth in the future. So it should just be left alone until it's realized as income. And you know, the people that advocate about saying, hey, fair share, we want those rich people to pay their fair share. But in order to get the votes to pass these kind of laws, they do things like like you got an $8,000 tax credit for those making up to $800,000 a year if the taxpayer will buy an EV, an electric vehicle. You're subsidizing rich people to purchase EVs. That doesn't make sense. And they also say, oh, and we'll repeal the repeal of the SALT. You know, there used to be a deduction on your federal taxes for your state and local taxes that you paid. That was done away with. Well, guess who hurts? Well, it's the rich people with the large houses that pay and in the high tax states. So if you're in a high tax place like San Francisco, Boston, or New York City, then you've lost a major tax reduction. It was essentially the more frugal states subsidizing these rich states, because here you have all these rich people getting this tax deduction for their taxes so they can enjoy this bigger house in this more expensive city. Well, the people saying we need fairer taxes are saying we need to restore this tax break to the rich. There's a lot of hypocrisy in politics, as you well know. Sorry for the cynicism, but that's just it. And one other tax, the corporate profits tax. I've spoken out against this for years and years. I mean, it's inefficient. It distorts economic decision-making and activity. People spend things, not in the most judicious way, but just to minimize the corporate taxes. It's very costly to administer. I mean, you have to hire these high-powered tax accountants. There have been estimates that over 50% of the revenue from the corporate taxes, some companies have to pay that much just to comply with it. You get different tax breaks for different corporations at different times for different expenditures. It ends up that corporations effectively pay different tax rates. Some of them pay zero, others don't. Is that fair? No. What's fair? Well, my belief is fair is everybody pays the same tax rate. How do you get corporations to all pay the same tax rate? I've only been able to think of one way you do that. You make the tax rate zero. You don't tax corporations. They say, well, wait a minute, there's so much money there. Yeah, but the corporation is not the owner of that money. A corporation is a legal fiction. You raise taxes on Exxon. There's not a sentient creature named ExxonMobil that starts rolling around the floor in agony because his taxes have been raised. It's just a legal structure. The actual money eventually gets, it gets paid to suppliers, it gets paid to employees, it gets paid to shareholders, etc. Then it's income. Then you should tax it. It's like what I was talking about before with the proposals to tax wealth, not income, but just wealth that's sitting there. Well, that's what it is when a corporation has a profit there. Before they decide how much to reinvest or what advertising campaign to fund or whatever they want to do, let them have the money. And then eventually when that results in a profit that causes somebody to sell their shares, you tax the capital gain. Or if they pay a dividend, you tax the dividend. It makes no sense to take the money from the corporate. And it's not even the corporation's money. Legally, a corporation has a fiduciary responsibility to earn as much money as it can for its legal owners, the shareholders. So it's the shareholders that should be taxed, not the corporation, and they should be taxed when they receive actual income from the corporation. So that's kind of one of my pet causes, and the whole thing of corporate taxation has got even more absurd and ugly in recent years with this emphasis on DEI. They call it diversity, equity, inclusion, where corporations need to be woke. They need to take certain positions on certain political issues, like opposing the Florida law that Governor DeSantis passed about, don't teach kindergartners about gay sex and things like that. Most of us would say, hey, it's fine with me if the kindergartners get spared that stuff. But Disney says, no, I got, this is all this pressure from diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I prefer to refer to as discrimination, exclusion, and intolerance, because they use it to discriminate against certain people. Just a lot of nonsense in corporate governance or misgovernance. You got ESG, environmental social governance scores. So you get somebody that's producing the natural gas that our country's economy depends on. They get a low score because that's got carbon dioxide in it. China uses slave labor and fouls its environment to produce these rare earth minerals that go into batteries, makes a mess of things, abuses human rights. They get a higher environmental, social, and governance score than an American corporation who doesn't do anything to anybody except supply the gas that we all need. I mean, this is insanity stuff. And again, the fair share argument, the corporations need to pay their fair share. The very people who say that are giving trillions of dollars of, well, not yet trillions, but it's scheduled to be more than trillions, but hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies to green energy companies. There you got corporations. They're not paying corporate profits tax. They're not paying any tax at all on their profits. Of course, they don't make profits. The only way they make profits is subsidies from the government. So that's, strongly unfair right there. Under President Trump, he got corporate tax rates reduced. That led to, well, first it led to protest. There you go. You're going to cut the tax rates. And so government revenue is going to go down. It didn't go down. It only went up a little bit the first year, but it did go up because although less money was collected by the government from corporate profits, there were more people working, there was more economic activity, it was a larger economic pie, and the government actually made more money. And if you look at all the economic literature, they studied the impact of corporate tax. Who actually pays? Remember, corporations are legal fictions. Taxes only hurt real people. Which people or class of people gets hurt most by the corporate income tax? It turns out it's the employees. And in fact, with this Trump tax cut on corporations, we saw the lowest unemployment rate in half a century, and the workforce was booming, and you had all-time highs in incomes for working class Hispanics and Blacks. The American worker benefited greatly from cutting corporate profits tax. Now, our Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, says, oh, gee, this is a race to the bottom. We're trying to compete with other countries, excuse me. We need to establish a treaty to have a minimum global tax. No. We should have a competition for who has the lowest tax. Ireland did that in the 1980s. They became a magnet for all the EU major corporations because they had a top tax rate on corporate profits of only 12.5%. We should beat the Irish and go to 0%. This would be the favored destination. As it was, some of you may remember under President Obama, John Kerry was saying, he was calling American corporations Benedict Arnolds, traitors to America, because of corporate inversions, where they were taking the headquarters of American corporations and transplanting them overseas, only to escape the heavy taxes of America. Can you imagine that? Historically, businesses would flock to America because this was the place of golden opportunities. This was the place to make money. But our government has become so predatory in trying to tax these corporations that the corporations are fleeing. They're trying to escape. And then the people like John Kerry try to shame them into keeping their head on the chopping block by calling them Benedict Arnolds. Terrible. By the way, under Mr. Obama, we also had a record number of Americans revoke their citizenship because he was harassing them so much about how to report income. And they finally just said, hey, I love America, but I can't afford to be an American citizen living overseas. So, this is just stupid taxation. It's just punitive and not leading to any realistic, revenue stream for the country. The country's revenue is actually improving under the lower tax cuts, but they expire next year. That's going to be one of 2025's big issues in Congress. And of course, it depends who's in the White House to see if those tax cuts for corporations can be extended where the top rate stays at 21%. I would love it to go to 0. It isn't going to happen. The political consensus is a long way away from what old Hendrickson wants. But at least let's not raise corporate taxes, because that burden falls most heavily on the workers, and we don't want to do that to American workers. Okay, folks, it's not even 8 o'clock. It's 7:53. I'm running out of voice. I get too exercise on this tax thing. Thank you for hanging in there. I mean, I know it's not a real cheerful topic. Let me take some questions here, and maybe we can wrap it up in a few more minutes, but I'm happy to hear what's on your mind.
All right, so for the Q&A session, so if you have any question, you can go to the reaction button and click on the raise your hand, or you can send me a message directly to ask. So in fact, I already have a few questions already sent. So one of our speakers asked, due to state and federal government shutdowns because of COVID, are you seeing local, state, and federal taxes increase across the U.S. to recruit lost taxes because of job losses, so income tax and sales taxes, businesses closing their doors? My property tax just went up 24 to 37%, depending on which township you live in, with no good answer for the increase.
Wow. You've highlighted a massive and very important problem. Federal finances are a mess. State finances are a mess. Many cities' finances are a mess. COVID aggravated that. Progressive ideology, where you don't punish shoplifters. Some of these cities are having a hard time finding tenants for their business rental space because the cities have become so unattractive and unprofitable. I think what I would say to keep an eye on most closely here is actually the federal government. We had a federal system, and there were supposed to be clear boundary lines between municipal finance, county finance, state finance, and national or federal finance. But politicians want to do what they can do to be popular, and I think we've already seen signs of bailouts. Even the Federal Reserve got into the act, I think, by buying up some of the bonds of some of these states that were in trouble. I think you're just going to see people in Washington try to take care of their allies in New York and Chicago and St. Louis and Los Angeles and on and on and on. My crystal ball is really fuzzy here. I don't know how this is going to play out. I think it's going to be somewhat tumultuous. It's going to be a bumpy road. And I just hope we don't end up with the federal government arrogating even more power to itself. But they're the ones with the deepest pockets. They're the ones that are the biggest spenders. And so they're going to be the ones that have the biggest impact. And we could see a sort of semi-absorption or some partnership arrangement between states and the federal government that wasn't supposed to be part of our system, but is just, rather than let a key electoral state go broke, say Illinois, and talk about a bankrupt system. Wow. Don't be surprised if there are people in Washington say, we can't let this happen to our friends in Illinois, even though Illinois needs to go through that so they can eventually get on a sounder financial footing. I mean, it's like they're postponing the inevitable, just like Social Security, postponing the inevitable. Reforms need to be made. They're not politically popular. And so we kick the can down the road. We extend the problem. We allow the problem to get worse. And then the usual approach is ambitious politicians in Washington say, I'll be your hero. I'll call the cavalry. We'll ride to your rescue. We'll bail you out. I think you're going to see more federal bailouts.
All right, we have another question from one of the audience asking, what have we statistically found out from states with no income tax compared to states with an income tax?
Well, what I've found out is it seems to me that American people, folks like you and I, much prefer to live where taxes are lower. And indeed, the migratory trends within America are from California to Texas. You got a very high tax jurisdiction in California. You got the state of Texas without an income tax, zero income tax. So this is just Econ 101, really. I think people, everything else being equal, people want to keep their money. And they're finding that the low tax states are preferable to live in the high tax states. Again, you have the Uncle Sam with that one of those last things I was talking about with trying to give the rich who live in these high tax states a tax break on their federal taxes because they're paying so much to state taxes. There's a little bit of cronyism or special interest politics going on right there. I hope they don't get away with that. And because it does put more of the burden then on the more frugal states.
So another question that somebody asked is, as an economist, which tax system would you prefer to see implement? So recently they said the House Representative Warren Davidson recently stated he wants to introduce an amendment to abolish the 16th Amendment. You as an economist, how would you phase out the 16th Amendment and then say either replace with either say a user tax or a flat tax? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a tough issue. Conservatives and libertarians are kind of divided. Gosh, I can remember decades ago, there was this big issue about, was the 16th Amendment even done legally? It's a little bit like the election of 2020, were they done regularly? But that's a distraction. The key question here is, I wouldn't mind seeing it repealed. From an purely economic point of view, and even people on the left will agree, the most rational tax is called a consumption tax. It'd be like a sales tax, so that you don't have the Internal Revenue Service prying into your every business affair. The right of privacy being restored. Whatever, every time you buy something, you pay a tax. The problem simply is that has been a major source of revenue, locally and at the state level. So if you pile on federal taxes to that, it's going to be quite huge and will create incentives for trying to get around it in various ways. Look, maybe it is the best way to go. I know theoretically it is. In the real world with real people trying to keep their tax burdens to a minimum, I don't know how viable it is. Maybe we'll find out if they experiment with it or not. A safer approach in terms of us being more familiar with how it act would be continuing to tax income, but to do it at a flat rate. I mean, the graduated income tax rate of Karl Marx does not belong in the United States of America. It never did. We really went off the rails on that one. It's caused nothing but problems. It's been used as fuel to wage this class warfare, which is so stupid because we're all Americans and we've created a prosperous society by working together and cooperating. Yes, some people have gotten very, very rich in that system, and it's because they've delivered very, very much value to their fellow man, their fellow citizen. So it's like, it's not like one class has been taking from another. It's through mutual collaboration and cooperation. We just keep getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. So we don't need class warfare. Graduated income taxes are an instrument of class warfare. They don't fit any ethical principle that I can think of. Basically, the only way you get a graduated tax passed is through a democratic majority. There's more of us than there are of you, so we're going to impose a higher tax rate on this minority of rich folks over here. In other words, might makes right. There's more of us than you. That's just the crude theory that might makes right. It doesn't. What's fair, it's in Leviticus 19:15. It said, treat everybody the same. The rich, the poor, there's one law for everybody. So one tax rate for everybody. So if we go the income tax route, absolutely a flat tax. You probably have to make some concessions at the really lower income. I'd love to see us get to the point, though, where our war on poverty has been a disaster. I mean, depends how you look at it. See, people say, well, there's no acute poverty level, just a very small number of people who have, addiction problems or psychological problems, but basically poverty's been eliminated. Yes, in terms of standard of living, but by constant subsidies of the lowest 20%. I'd love to see these people become self-supporting and work full-time jobs and help contribute to the Social Security system, which needs some revenue, so on and so forth. Okay, I'm getting off on a tangent there. Consumption taxes theoretically are the best. I'm favorably disposed to them. I'm not sure they're practical. So the next best is a flat income tax rate.
All right, we have another question. So, one of our let's see, one of our viewers said that they live in Minnesota. So 10 years ago, they said one of our major corporations and employers, Medtronic, arranged a merger with an Irish company where it is now domiciled. Within months, the president visited Minnesota and made a very public speech criticizing the decision. Obviously, the company's reasons behind the move involve taxation. Didn't know what your thoughts on that situation would be.
Yeah, I don't think I can add anything to what I've already said. The corporations have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to maximize profit. If you can domicile, if you're domiciled where there's a predatory tax authority that is impeding the return on investment to the people you owe an investment to, I think you have a moral and legal fiduciary responsibility to try to increase your profitability. And if that means re-domiciling, go ahead and do it. I love this country. I mean, but these people who say, well, you're being disloyal to your country. that's like saying a chicken that wants to take his head off the chopping block is being disloyal to farmers. I mean, it's just this whole hostility to corporations is just wrongheaded. There are wealth creators. And if you stop taxing corporate profits, it doesn't mean that government sources of revenue are going to shrivel up. They'll just take different forms, and you'll tax the real people, and people can see what they're being taxed. Let me just interject this. Excuse me, it's not an answer to your question, but I just read a reminder. Milton Friedman, the one big mistake the free market economist Milton Friedman did, he was the one who during World War II said, when government was desperate for revenues, he's the one who said, why don't you institute withholding of wages? If you take away wage withholding so that people had to write a check directly to the government every quarter, I think they would see more clearly just how much they're getting taxed. And anyhow, I'm entirely on the side of the private property owners, the owners of the corporations, and I think that our government, if we want to really honor the spirit and the history of America, I think we should have the lowest taxes in the world because we want to be the friendliest country in the world to wealth creation. I mean, none of us likes poverty, right? What's the antidote for poverty? Wealth creation. So let's reduce barriers to wealth creation, and corporate profits tax are such a barrier. And if our own government is not smart enough to get rid of those tax burdens, then I can't blame a company that relocates overseas. Shouldn't be that way. Our own government should have a policy that welcomes it. But that's why it happened. I mean, they're honoring their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders.
So another question asked is, what are your thoughts on Herman Cain's 999 plan? And do you think there's still any viability with that in today's economy?
Well, I'm going to make a confession here. I remember reading about the 999 plan a few years ago, and it went in one ear and not the other, and not because it was necessarily a bad idea, but I just, every few years there's a burst of energy in the conservative movement for a more rational, less punitive, fairer tax system. And I'm for all those things. And I think a lot of these proposals are much fairer than the existing one. I have to admit, I give into a certain sense of fatigue in terms of just feeling like, hey, that's a great idea, but it's just not going to fly. We're not there yet. We don't have enough of a consensus on this. We don't have enough people who understand economics. We still have this horrible, ignorant anti-wealth mentality, anti-corporate mentality. And so I apologize. I cannot comment specifically on the 999 plan, but I'll tell you this without remembering what it is. It's better than what we got now.
All right. Another question somebody asked is, if you had to use a user tax, how much more money do you think the federal and state governments would collect? They say that this would capture individuals working under the table, illegal transactions, and creative tax returns filed out by individuals and tax payers.
Wow. I cannot quantify any of these things. Even the people who spend their full time, in the quantitative economics, I think they'd have a hard time with it. But what you alluded to there about, tax cheats and that, the higher the rate, the greater the incentive to cheat, and we do have cheating. In fact, this kind of should be embarrassing, but the left seems very shameless. But they found a few years ago under, well, I think it was again under President Obama, uh, there were a number of congressional staffers, a number of White House staffers who were underpaying their federal income tax. So it's not just the fellow that paints your house or does a little landscaping in your yard for cash. I mean, there are a lot of people that do that, but there are some very well-educated white-collar people who know better, who even preach it against it, and yet they themselves will dodge taxes when they can. But it's human nature being what it is. The higher the tax rate, the greater the incentive to cheat. And so again, that's why, I mean, I would love it if we had a top tax rate of 10%. I don't know that many people would be willing to risk jail just to save another 10%. To save 50% of their income, yeah, some of them are going to cheat. There's some still would at 10%, but I don't think as many. So I would love it. And we're never going to get there until, and this is where, I did my doctorate actually on supply side economics, and the supply siders contributed a lot of useful economic knowledge. But there's one major area where they blew it, and I said it to them, and that is they did not realize or talk about the economic truth that the true measure of the cost of government is not what it taxes today, but what it spends today, some of which is taxed today, some of which will be taxed tomorrow, either through direct taxes or the indirect tax of inflation. So I just think that I think I just ran out of voice and lost my train of thought. So I'm gonna stop right there. I apologize. Come back at me again if you want me to add a little more in a certain area.
All right. So those are some of the questions so far that have been uh, sent via the chat. So if there are any more questions, you can still continue to send them. We probably have time for a couple more. So another way is if you go to the reactions button and do the raise hand, I'll make sure to unmute you so you can ask your question.
I just popped one up here. Let me answer this one about somebody wrote concerning the federal debt. You keep hearing that the federal debt is unsustainable, and yet it continues. And that is, it's just going to make the eventual collapse that much worse. We've got too many people have an incentive to keep this ridiculous arrangement going as long as we can. At what point will it collapse? I don't know. Nobody knows. It's just that it's clearly getting to a point of absurdity. We are now up to like paying $1 trillion a year just interest on the national debt. And as the debt continues to balloon, it's going to absorb more and more of our income tax dollars. And I think it eventually gets to a point where, when you're swallowing your own tail, when the government is just spending so much of its tax revenues just paying interest on the national debt that it just doesn't have enough to fund its other programs unless it starts printing money, in which case the dollar goes down the tube. So we're bumping up against the limits, but could this farce continue for another 5 or 10 years? I suppose so. I mean, I can remember in the 80s when I first studied with Dr. Senholtz and, looking at what the debt was then when it just got over 1 trillion. And I thought, this can't last. And here we are at 34 trillion. And we're still going. So this is a baffling question and nobody knows when. It's just clearly it is unsustainable eventually. And I can't tell you when eventually is, but watch those payments on, watch the share of federal revenues going to pay off the existing debt. And as that continues to grow, I mean, eventually you're going to see some sort of market reaction to that, because I mean, that is the major warning sign, I think.
So let's see. Okay, we got another question. So it's can you add an economic perspective on the current policy related to immigration and board security? I was an economic major at GCC, and I think about the load on this country's power grid. So
Yeah, it's a dilemma, immigration. I mean, I'm only like second generation American. I have sympathy for immigration. Our birth rate is not high enough in terms of native-born Americans to sustain the welfare state. We do have shortages in certain areas. So I do think we need some immigration. The $1 million question is always how much. And I think it's absolutely abominable that the current administration just disregards the national border. That to me is unfathomable and unforgivable. This is a great place to come to, but that doesn't mean everybody in the world has a right to come in. I think we have a right to screen the people that come in. It needs to be an orderly infusion of people. I do think, I mean, I believe the statistics that talk about 50% of entrepreneurial ventures are started up by foreign-born people. They often come, the incentive that motivates them to leave a familiar place to come to a new place often that's the kind of person who becomes a great entrepreneur. But we need secure borders. We need to filter out people that have contagious diseases. We need to filter out the criminals. I read today, somehow our immigration authorities are trying to keep track of 670,000 people with illegal immigrants with criminal records. Why do we keep track? I mean, it's like, if you know they've got the criminal record, sayonara, send them out of here. We don't want them. So that affiliation with terrorist groups, Chinese nationals coming in. How do we know how many of these people are working for the Communist Party over there, or are part of their military forces or whatever? What are Chinese people doing crossing the Rio Grande? So it's like, just in terms of sheer national defense, we need to police and control who comes into the country. From an economic point of view, we do need some immigrants. We do need some new blood. We do need additional ideas and manpower and so on and so forth. I can't tell you how much, and that's where it always gets political and you end up working out a compromise or whatever. But the current situation, as chaotic as it is, as totally out of control as it is, it has to go. It's a disgrace. And well, I could get really hot here and say a couple of politically charged statements, but I'll let each of you come to your own conclusion on that one.
So I did get another question from one of our viewers, and they asked, how does our current current tax system incentivize elements of cronyism in the United States?
That's a really profound question. I've always associated cronyism with the spending side of the budget. Although, like I say, one of the things that has made the corporate profits tax unfair is that specific exemptions or credits are granted to certain corporations or certain industries at certain times. It's like, why is it fair for the guy who makes capital expenditures in 2024 to get a tax break when his competitor who made those same improvements in 2022 did not get a tax break? So yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of political favors going on, in terms of the tax system. And I think they're indefensible in an ethical sense. And so that's why I say just get rid of the darn corporate profits tax. Hope that answers your question. If I missed it a little, try again.
I think we have time for one more question. So,
well, I'll tell you, Hunter, this is, I think we've set the record tonight for a number of questions. And it kind of makes me feel good because, like I said, I was worried that taxation can be a boring topic. And the fact that we have this many questions shows how deeply our listeners care about the topic. So, all right, give me that last one. See if I can come up with anything here.
all right. So, okay. We did get one more. So they ask, with everything you stated tonight, how should we as individuals bring more awareness and talk about the economic illiteracy in the country, especially with regards to American taxation? How can we do something about dealing with that?
Wow. Great question. Vitally important question. There is a battle for the mind and soul and heart of America right now. Personally, I've never been that good about going out and being a preacher. I've been grateful to have been given a teaching opportunity at Grove City College where I could share my knowledge with the young people and then do my writing on the side and spread the word that way. What can the average non-economist do? You know, I'm tempted to say support groups that promote this message, but I mean, there's so many groups out there now with the handout asking for donations. I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I would just keep your eyes open for the opportunities. This is going to take a collective effort over an extended period of time. If you feel inclined to write, if you can write letters to your editor of local papers, if there still are local papers, you know, I guess on the social media side, see, I don't do the social media things because those get so ugly, but I know there are sites where people get together and they share their ideas. And if the folks on the left are going to be hollering and making their case, I suppose there ought to be some folks on the right doing the same thing, not just yielding the field to the others. So I would just say whatever opportunity you can see and feel comfortable in contributing, a venue to speak out. That's the thing. If you understand the basics, is finding a way to share that. And I know that's tough because I mean you hear these sad stories of families that get split because of, you know, ideological differences of politics and so on and so forth. But you know, emphasize the fairness. The left always talks about fair, 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 fair. And I'm telling you, a flat tax is fair and a graduated tax isn't. And just appeal to the goodness in people, to their innate sense of justice and fairness. And even then, some of them aren't going to listen to you, but just, you know it's right. And I just wish you well in finding the best opportunities for sharing what you know. I'm sorry I don't have an easy answer for you on that. Good question, and I'm glad you're thinking along those lines.
Well, I can officially say tonight we have definitely broken a record. So this has been fantastic in terms of questions tonight. So yeah, as a student fellow, I know at the Institute we have some of our scholars currently, like Mark Henderson, obviously do the lectures. We also have Dr. Sean Rittenauer, who's written several books as well on foundations of economics. Another fellow of our scholars is Dr. Fuller at Grove City. He wrote a short book on No Free Lunch, which is a really short book and really terrific. It's every Grove City has to take as a class on principles of micro, and it kind of sums it all up. So for those of you who are asking, like, what can we do now? I know here at the Institute, we have a lot of resources and are very fortunate to have scholars, including Mark here tonight, to explain and bring about economic literacy to our viewers. So again, thank you, Mark, so much for um, doing these lectures. And um, yeah, no, I truly appreciate them as a fellow student fellow here. So thank you again, Mark, so much.
Well, thank you, Hunter, and thanks to all of you who hung in there tonight on this amazing topic of taxation. So good night and God bless.